Not only did we confirm that the virus came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China, we also were able to name the first 3 people sickened by the virus.
A new report on the online platform Substack says scientists at the lab in Wuhan were the first COVID-19 patients in the fall of 2019 while conducting controversial gain-of-function research. The story names the scientists as Ben Hu, Yu Ping, and Yan Zhu. Jamie Metzel, a former World Health Organization advisor, called the revelation explosive in an interview with Fox's Laura Ingraham to air this evening.
And it looks more and more like there was an accident followed by a criminal cover-up.
FBI Director Christopher Wray told Bret Baier the Bureau's theory about COVID's origin back on February 28th.
The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan.
Yet the White House chief medical advisor during the pandemic has offered other explanations.
Totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human.
We have an open mind, but it looks very, very much like this was a natural occurrence.
Dr. Robert Redfield was CDC director during the pandemic.
I'm very disappointed in how he's responded to this. Largely, I think it's grounded in his advocacy for gain-of-function research.
Kansas Senator Roger Marshall says these latest revelations make China and Fauci look bad.
We now can show everybody that what Dr. Fauci was telling us, what China was telling us, what the World Health Organization was telling us was a big lie. And they knew it was a lie all along.
The Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office is out with a new report which found that U.S. taxpayer dollars flowed to Chinese entities, including the Wuhan lab, ahead of the COVID-19 outbreak. The money came from the National Institutes of Health and the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Ever since the COVID-19 pandemic began more than 3 years ago, there's been a continuing debate about what was the origin of the virus. Did it occur naturally in nature, or was something more sinister afoot? And now the Sunday Times of London, one of the most prestigious newspapers in the world, says after a massive investigation, the evidence suggests that the pandemic was the result of a lab leak at China's Wuhan Institute of Virology, where a secret military program was attempting to create a global bioweapon. The argument being here that the Chinese military wanted to create a virus, develop a super virus, develop a vaccine for it to protect its own people, and then unleash it on the world. And we all know that what did happen was devastating. 7 million people have died. Global economy still hasn't fully recovered. Now, the interesting thing is that this theory at the beginning of the pandemic was dismissed by many as a conspiracy theory, anti-China. But the Sunday Telegraph says after enormous research by a team of its investigators, looking at previously top secret and secret government documents, emails, studies, interviews with some of the top U.S. Virus investigators, that they've all come to the conclusion that this is the most likely thing that happened. Now how did it happen? The evidence suggests that this started out legitimately, that the Wuhan Institute, after the SARS crisis in 2003, which was another version of the coronavirus, wanted to do research to develop a vaccine that would be effective not only against SARS, but to any new SARS variants that might occur. And at that point, they got funding from a U.S. charity, and they got assistance from one of the leading coronavirus experts in the United States about how to do the manipulation of viruses. And part of that was a thing called a gain of function. And what that means is you through experiments, you make the virus more deadly and more capable of spreading in order to develop a vaccine that will stop it, will protect people. And for a time, the Wuhan Institute was publicly reporting about this. Here's the progress. They were sending out progress reports. Although there was growing concern in the international community that they were doing this work in labs that weren't secure. One of the experts said that he thinks the worst virus they developed didn't get out, that there was a worse one that they have compared to COVID-19. And that fortunately it didn't get out. But that raises the question of, do they still have it? And apparently what happened was this all starts in 2003. It's all going fine. 2016, they apparently find a new coronavirus in a mine in a province of China. And that's when the public information goes dark. And that's when all these experts interviewed by the Sunday Times said if it's true, this horrendous and evil plan came into effect.
One of the biggest cover-ups by scientists and government officials of our time. An astonishing deception that warrants apologies and retractions. Tonight, the damning evidence that proves that the very scientists and leading government officials who told us COVID-19 came from a wet market actually suspected it was genetically engineered in a Wuhan lab. A cache of emails and Slack messages has been subpoenaed by a United States congressional committee. The US Select Subcommittee on the Origins of COVID-19 subpoenaed emails and Slack messages from the scientists who wrote a paper published in the prestigious journal Nature Medicine that said the virus had a natural origin. They insisted a laboratory leak was a conspiracy. The private correspondence shows how the group of international scientists, including from Australia, colluded to insist COVID-19 had a natural origin. Spurred on by Anthony Fauci, they would insist any likelihood of human error for this outbreak was a conspiracy theory. But that's not what they said privately. This is the most extraordinary revelation. Have a look at what these leading scientists, who would go on to call the lab leak a conspiracy, who would go on to tell governments, policymakers, journalists, and intelligence agencies that COVID came from a wet market. Well, this is what those scientists said in private. Evolutionary biologist, University of Sydney's Edward Holmes said, and I quote, "Ian Lipkin just called, very worried about the furin cleavage site, and says that high-ups are as well, including in intelligence." He said, let's face it, unless there's a whistleblower from the Wuhan Institute of Virology who is going to defect and live in the West under a new identity, we are never going to know what happened in that lab. Never. Christian Anderson, another one of the authors of the Proximal Origins paper, said, "I think the main thing still in my mind is that the lab escape version of this is so friggin' likely to have happened because they were already doing this type of work and the molecular data is fully consistent with that scenario." He said, "I hate when politics is injected into science, but it's impossible not to, especially given the circumstances." In this private Slack conversation dated February the 1st, they also discuss whether to destroy the world, meaning say there's a lab leak, they're speaking metaphorically, based on their analysis. Another scientist, Andrew Rambeau, said, and I quote, "Given the shit show that would happen if anyone serious accused the Chinese of even accidental release, my feeling is we should say, given there is no evidence of a specifically engineered virus, we cannot possibly distinguish between natural evolution and escape, so we are content with ascribing it to natural processes." In another Slack message, Andrew Rambeau said, "The whole thing is doing my brain in. I literally swivel day by day, thinking it is a lab escape or natural." Another scientist, Robert Gary, said, and I quote, "Transmitting a bat virus like RATG13 in HeLa cells and then asking your graduate student to insert a furin site would get you there. In another message, he said, "It's not crackpot to suggest this could have happened given the gain-of-function research we know is happening." And Anthony Fauci, who was the coronavirus advisor to both President Trump and then President Biden, and he's been a health advisor to generations of presidents, he said this in an email, and I quote, "They were concerned about the fact that upon viewing the sequences of several isolates of the new coronavirus, there were mutations in the virus that would be most unusual to have evolved naturally in the bats, and that there was a suspicion that this mutation was intentionally inserted. The suspicion was heightened by the fact that scientists in Wuhan University are known to have been working on gain-of-function experiments to determine the molecular mechanisms associated with bat viruses adapting to human infection, and the outbreak which originated in Wuhan." There are hundreds of pages of this stuff. As I say, it is damning. This is what these scientists were saying to each other in private. They've tried to stop many journalists and many organizations getting their hands on this correspondence under Freedom of Information laws, but now subpoenaed and obtained by a United States congressional subcommittee. And just a reminder about what these very scientists were saying in public. Well, they wrote an article published in the prestigious Nature Medicine journal. They called it "The Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2." It was published in March 2020. A draft was completed a month earlier. And in it, they insisted a lab leak was a conspiracy. They wrote, "Our analysis clearly show that SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct or a purposefully manipulated virus." When I started investigating the Wuhan Institute of Virology back in April of 2020, one of the scientists, Eddie Holmes, was quoted by Media Watch as saying that this was a conspiracy theory. Christian Anderson, another scientist, he publicly described suggestion the virus was genetically manipulated as a crackpot theory. He said that on the 3rd of February 2020, whereas I've just shown you what he was saying in private. And at the same time as this group was having discussions about whether the virus was in fact genetically engineered. Many of these scientists would go on to advise the intelligence community. And the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in the United States released a statement we now know is false. That statement in early 2020 said, "The intelligence community also concurs with the wide scientific consensus that the COVID-19 virus was not man-made or genetically modified." The former editor-in-chief of the Australian newspaper, Chris Mitchell, wrote in his column today, "Media Watch, the wider ABC and Channel 9 papers have produced one-sided coverage designed to reinforce the idea the virus spread from a wet market in the Chinese city of Wuhan rather than from a laboratory in the nearby Wuhan Institute of Virology." He wrote that ABC management should be asking Paul Barry and his team why it spent so much airtime in the past 3.5 years trying to suppress a story that looks increasingly probable. Chris Mitchell also, in his column today, quotes journalist Matt Taibbi as saying that the emails and the correspondence between the scientists show how health officials and scientists constructed perhaps the most impactful media deception of modern times, exceeding even the weapons of mass destruction fiasco.
A lot of the theories about, the virus having been engineered or put together in a laboratory were not true, because here was a virus in nature that had a receptor binding domain with exactly the same structure.
I just find it all interesting based on what my other colleague here, the chairman of the committee, said in with reply to the issue of the penguins. But something else that happened between those 2 days is one of your colleagues, who's not here today but was invited, Dr. Rambut, he said, I don't know if I should say this in committee room or not, but given the blank show that this would happen if anyone seriously accused the Chinese of even accidental release. My feeling is we should say that given there is no evidence of a specifically engineered virus, we cannot possibly distinguish between natural evolution and escape, so we are content with ascribing it to natural processes. His concern was, would he piss off China? That's what his concern was. So look, something happened here. Politicians may flip-flop. Scientists do not flip-flop in a matter of 72 hours. And whether it was the fear of accusing communist China for this leak, whether it was needing to get the FBI involved in what that might lead to down the line, whether it was the fact that millions of US dollars had made their way, by the way, to communist China. Interesting chart I have here, $3.7 million. Were any of you aware during any of these, whether it's drafting this paper or conversations with Fauci, that communist China received $3.7 million of American tax dollars, including to the Wuhan Institute of Virology? Was that ever come up in any conversations with Dr. Fauci?
It did not.
Okay. Dr. Anderson, no?
It did not, and while I was aware of some of the work, I was not aware of the funding going, because that is obviously irrelevant to understanding the origin itself.
In April, just a few short months ago, this committee held a hearing where the former director of the National Intelligence Agency, John Ratcliffe, testified. In that testimony, Director Ratcliffe said, and I quote, "If our intelligence and evidence supporting a lab leak theory was placed side by side with our intelligence and evidence pointing to a naturally occurring spillover theory, the lab leak side of the ledger would be long and overwhelming, while the spillover side would be nearly empty," unquote. I'm addressing what we heard Radcliffe tell us as a committee that wasn't the case, that overwhelmingly the information at hand provided by the intelligence communities showed that this was not a naturally occurring process. Dr. Anderson, in your testimony, you said the recently declassified report from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence does, as you said, conclude that there is no evidence to suggest this virus came from the lab. However, the ODNI also states in their reports the Department of Energy and the Federal Bureau of Investigation assessed that a laboratory-associated incident was the most likely cause of the first human infection of SARS-CoV-2. Dr. Anderson, you also said in your testimony, we do not believe that any type of laboratory-based scenario is plausible. And yet the conclusions by the Department of Energy and the FBI directly contradict your position. How do you bring that together?
I think you could say that our conclusions completely contradict their conclusions too. I think it's important to understand that we are looking at different things here. You're talking about the intelligence community. If you look at the scientific literature, the scientific evidence for this pointing to a single market in the middle of Wuhan is overwhelming. There is no evidence.
But the intelligence committee had access to both scientific and the investigative reports. They had that overview. And their conclusions strongly contradict what your single conclusion projects. And we as a committee have heard this repeatedly, that the overview from both the FBI and the Department of Energy support that there was a lab leak, support that the most likely cause of the first human infection of SARS-CoV-2 was a laboratory incident. We recognize how that occurred.
Last week, members of the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic in the House released a report that provides some pretty compelling information on what scientists knew about COVID's origins and a potential lab leak. Now, what's interesting about this is as I go through the details of the story, you can see that due to political pressure, the scientists felt the need to downplay what some of their thoughts were, some of what their research was, And I want you to kind of focus on that as I go through all the details. Now, here's what you need to know. Much of that report is about a paper released in March 17th of 2020 titled "The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2." Now, that paper was widely cited as evidence that COVID had emerged naturally rather than from a laboratory. Now, the authors of that paper wrote in no uncertain terms the following: "Our analyses clearly show that SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus, is not a laboratory construct or a purposefully manipulated virus." All right, case closed. That's what the research says, right? But what's fascinating about this story is the type of conversation that was taking place among these very scientists behind the scenes. And we have Slack messages to provide evidence of the kind of conversations they were having. So now we're learning that assertion that I just previously read to you is completely inconsistent with the author's private conversations, okay? So on February 2nd of 2020, the lead author of the paper said the following, okay? "I still believe," then he notes a particular virus is from Yan'an, which is about as far away from Wuhan as you can be and still be in China. Christian G. Anderson wrote, referring to a virus that produced COVID-like symptoms in minors in 2013, a strain that was later stored and researched at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. What are the chances of finding viruses that are 96% identical given that distance? Seems strange given how many SARS-like viruses we have in bats. Now, Anderson's feelings are even more clear in a Slack message that he sent responding to a colleague who wanted him to rule out the lab leak theory, okay? So pay close attention here, and we're gonna provide a screenshot. There's a screenshot of the Slack message that Christian Anderson had sent, Christian Anderson, and the text reads, "The main issue is that accidental escape is in fact highly likely. It's not some fringe theory." So why did the paper conclusively rule out the possibility of a lab leak when its lead author was so convinced of the contrary? Okay, so one reason is that the scientists were more concerned about the political ramifications toward China if they put out, a definitive report indicating that it is very likely to have been a lab leak. Okay, so Andrew Rambot, who's another author of the paper, said in a following Slack message, okay, and here's a screenshot of it: "Given the crap show that would happen if anyone serious accused the Chinese of even accidental release, my feeling is we should say that given there is no evidence of a specifically engineered virus, we cannot possibly distinguish between natural evolution and escape. So we are content with ascribing it to natural processes." And in response, Anderson wrote the following: "Yep, I totally agree that it's a very reasonable conclusion, although I hate when politics is injected into science, but it's impossible not to, especially given the circumstances. We should be sensitive to that." It is interesting that in this case, the scientists are making a political decision in regard to what the outcome of this paper or report should be, rather than just sticking to the science and being abundantly clear about what the likelihood is. It seems that Anthony Fauci may have also played a role in censoring the scientists' suspicions, right? The suspicions that it could have originated from a lab leak. So going back to Christian Anderson, he wrote the following in an email on February 4th, 2020. "The idea of engineering a bioweapon is definitely not going away, and I'm still getting pinged by journalists. I have noticed some of them starting to ask more broadly about lab escape, and for now, I have just ignored them. There might be a time where we need to tackle that more directly head on, but I'll let the likes of Jeremy Farrar and Tony Fauci figure out how to do that." Okay, now another huge reason that scientists could have misrepresented their beliefs was to appease the publisher of this report. So it was eventually published in Nature Medicine, and apparently Nature Medicine initially rejected the paper in part because they feared that if it even suggested a possible lab leak was possible, Conspiracy theorists would run rampant with that information or with that possibility. And here's how Anderson responded to Nature Medicine when these concerns came up. Anderson pushed back against the rejection, assuring the Nature editor that their project had started with the goal of beating back conspiracy theories, but that the data and evidence made it impossible. None of this helps refute a lab origin, and the possibility must be considered as a serious scientific theory, which is what we do, and not dismissed out of hand as another conspiracy theory. We all really, really wish that we could do that. That's how this got started, but unfortunately, it's not possible given the data. Again, that is a statement from Christian Anderson on February 20th of 2020. Ultimately, the authors conceded and they changed their work rather than stand by their suspicions. The authors edited their paper further to more strongly dismiss the possibility of a lab leak for its later submission to Nature Medicine. The journal's publication of the paper just a month later effectively ended debate for a year or more as to the origin of the pandemic.
So I'm gonna read you one more devastating quote that shows you exactly where the problem came from. And then we'll talk about how you can tell whether scientists are telling the truth or not these days. And I hate that we're forced into that conversation because of the mistakes that these knuckleheads made. And knuckleheads is putting it politely. Anyway, here's another email that was discovered by the scientists. At the end, one of them writes, another says, anyway, it's done. Sorry the last bit had to be done without you. Pressure from on high. Okay, that's definitive. So that's government sources like Fauci and the others going, no, let's not say what's true. Let's put pressure on the scientists to skew the results in a certain way so people think that it is not from the lab.
Sydney University's Professor Eddie Holmes, who helped map the genome of SARS-CoV-2, went even further last month with a statement to say,
there is no evidence that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19 in humans, originated in a laboratory in Wuhan, China.
And the CSIRO, where the two Chinese scientists once studied bat viruses, agrees, telling MediaWatch,
research of the genome has found no evidence of laboratory manipulation, and there is no published evidence of this virus having been previously identified.
Last month, Professor Holmes also had this to say in a webcast.
There are a number of really clear reasons to believe this is not in any way a lab construct or a lab escape. It looks for all the world, and I'm certain it is, a natural coronavirus that's come from an animal in a natural setting. There's nothing in there at all that is a signature of laboratory manipulation. So I think we can pretty safely put those conspiracy theories to bed.
Safely put that conspiracy theory to bed. And he told the Sydney Morning Herald in October 2020, our conclusion was no, we couldn't see anything to indicate this could be anything other than a natural event. But privately, he was discussing the possibility of a lab leak with international scientists. He said this to his colleague, Christian Anderson, in April 2020. Let's face it, unless there's a whistleblower from the Wuhan Institute of Virology who's going to defect and live in the West under a new identity, we are never going to know what happened in that lab. Never. Anderson had expressed renewed concerns that he wasn't convinced that cell culture in a lab wasn't involved. Holmes, in that correspondence, still felt that natural origins was likely correct. In a private email 2 months before this, Holmes wrote to one of his colleagues, the director of Columbia University's Center of Infection and Immunity, Professor Ian Lipkin, on February the 10th in 2020, he wrote, I favour natural evolution myself, but the furin cleavage site is an issue. In this email chain with Ian Lipkin, Holmes says that Lipkin says that their paper is well-reasoned and provides a plausible argument against genetic engineering. Plausible. And then Lipkin adds, it does not eliminate the possibility of inadvertent release following adaptation through selection in culture at the institute in Wuhan. He writes, given the scale of the bat coronavirus research pursued there and the site of emergence of the first human cases, we have a nightmare of circumstantial evidence to assess. In this very same email chain, Eddie Holmes then replies, I agree. It is indeed striking that this virus is so closely related to SARS, yet is behaving so differently, seems to have been pre-adapted for human spread since the get-go. He says it's the epidemiology that I find most worrying. And even when the lead author on this proximal origins paper, Christian Anderson, submitted their paper to Nature, he told the editor that he couldn't rule out a lab leak. He wrote in an email to Nature editor Claire Thomas on February the 20th, "Unfortunately, none of this helps refute a lab origin, and the possibility must be considered as a serious scientific theory and not dismissed out of hand as another conspiracy theory." He wrote, "We all really, really wish that we could do that. That's how this got started. But unfortunately, it's just not possible given the data." And another co-author, Robert Gary, wrote on the 5th of February, and I quote, "Accidental release is a scenario many will not be comfortable with, but it would be irresponsible to dismiss the possibility out of hand." Yet publicly, we were all told by many of these scientists that a lab leak was a conspiracy. Eddie Holmes also didn't disclose as a potential conflict of interest on this proximal origins paper that his name was on sequences from a January 2018 paper about bat coronaviruses alongside a Wuhan Institute of Virology researcher who was a former postdoc student of his. The paper was rejected by medical journals and science journals. It was never published. Holmes said he forgot all about this. He blamed it on his bad memory in an online interview in September 2022.
And it shows my bad memory. So what happened was, in late July this year, I think it was 163 new bat coronavirus sequences appeared on GenBank from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Okay, with no paper, just this kind of posting. And the really shocking thing is on the GenBank submission, my name is on the GenBank submission, right? And so when I saw this, I thought, what is this? I couldn't compute, thinking, why am I on this, right? And then I look back, and then it turns out there was actually a paper that was never published. And I'll tell you the story. It's quite an amazing story. So I had an ex-postdoc called JQ, or Jay I call him. He was at me at Penn State, and then he went to Sydney with me. Then he moved to virology for a couple of years, and then he moved to Shanghai. He's in Shanghai, very, very smart guy, who mainly worked on endogenous viruses. In my head, he's an endogenous virus guy. But he did this one study he was involved in on these bat coronaviruses that they'd sequenced.
And it goes on. The unpublished paper included the partial sequence of RATG13, which is one of the closest known genetic relatives to SARS-CoV-2.
I think it gives you a snapshot of what they were working on in that lab the year before the pandemic starts. RATG13, RA4991, that's there. And critically, they only have the RDRP and I think ORF8. There's no spike protein for that virus. It's not there. They didn't have it at that point, okay? And most of all, what this paper shows you is what they're working on, and it's SARS-1.
Holmes's central claim is that the Wuhan Institute of Virology has no progenitor virus to SARS-CoV-2, no virus that could have been used to make COVID-19. But declassified intelligence has repeatedly said that the Wuhan lab was working on top-secret projects that are not in the public domain. And we know that the Wuhan Institute of Virology took its virus database offline in September 2019 and has never made it public, even to health officials trying to investigate the origins of the virus, including the World Health Organization.
This morning, the CIA confirms it's looking into accusations that several members of an agency team tasked with COVID pandemic analysis were paid significant hush money to shift their position regarding the origins of the virus. 2 Republican lawmakers have sent a letter to CIA Director William Burns claiming that a senior-level current agency officer came forward alleging the payoff. They say, according to the whistleblower, 7 officers were assigned to the CIA's COVID discovery team, and 6 of the 7 members of the team believed the intelligence and science were sufficient to make a low-confidence assessment that COVID-19 originated from a laboratory in Wuhan, China. The letter claims only one person on that team, who was most senior, believed that COVID could have been transmitted from animals to humans, but that to come to the eventual public determination of uncertainty, the other 6 members were given a significant monetary incentive to change their position. The whistleblower did not explain the payments or who might have made them. The CIA tells ABC News, "We are committed to the highest standards of analytic rigor, integrity, and objectivity. We do not pay analysts to reach specific conclusions." The origins of COVID have been the subject of several congressional hearings. Former CDC Director Dr. Robert Redfield earlier this year testified he was excluded from discussions because he believed the lab leak theory warranted investigation.
It was told to me that they wanted a single narrative and that I obviously had a different point of view.
Dr. Anthony Fauci called that accusation untrue. In June, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence said the CIA and another agency were unable to decide on where they think COVID's origins lie, as both hypotheses rely on significant assumptions or face challenges with conflicting reporting. This new letter is asking for documents related to the COVID discovery team's creation, communications about COVID's origins, and records of any financial bonuses. The letter is asking for that information to be turned over by September 26th.